Here's our game plan regarding setting up and enabling identity awareness in our hands-on lab. For our end result, we want to require identity awareness of Bob the user, before traffic is allowed from his computer at .100 on the 10.3.0 network over to a web server at 67.83.0.100. Now, to pull this off, we're going to want to enable identity awareness on Firewall 2 so it has that capability. Secondly, we want to identify the sources of how Firewall 2 can learn and associate users with specific IP addresses. And a couple of options include we could train Firewall 2 to use Active Directory if we're in a Microsoft environment. And that's also presuming that Bob is logging in and is part of Active Directory. Or if Bob is on a mobile device or some other device that's not part of Active Directory, we could do a captive portal. And the final piece in making this happen is we need to create an access role object that identifies the requirements of Bob and or the source network that he's on and or the source computer that he's on as part of an access role object, and then include that in a policy that Firewall 2 is going to have installed on it. So without further ado, let's go to our management PC and to Smart Console, and let's configure this. So here on our Client NUG administrative computer, we'll go ahead and launch Smart Console. And logging in as admin, we'll connect over to our management server at .110 and click Login. So step number one is to go ahead and enable identity awareness on Firewall 2. So to do that, on the left-hand side, we'll go ahead and click on Gateways and Servers on that tab. And from here, we'll simply double-click on Firewall 2 to edit the details of Firewall 2. In this bottom section here for network security, we're going to put a check in this checkbox next to Identity Awareness. So we'll put a check next to Identity Awareness, and that brings up a wizard that's going to help us identify the sources from where we might learn the identity. So for now, we'll do Active Directory and browser-based authentication, so we have both of those options, and click on Next. So next it's asking us for the administrator credentials so that we can access Active Directory. So I'm going to put in the username of administrator. That's an administrator at nuggetlab.com in Active Directory. And the password is our lab password that we've been using consistently throughout all these labs. And with the username and password provided as a domain administrator from Active Directory, we'll go ahead and click Connect. So with our connection successful to Active Directory, we'll click on Next to continue. And I love this part. It's showing you an example of how you might implement a security policy based on identity awareness. So we could have in our source column, we could have finance users, that's a group. If they're going to anywhere, if the service is TCP port 80 HTTP, then go ahead and allow it. But if you don't know who they are, says the firewall, go ahead and display a captive portal and ask them who they are. And then when they provide their credentials, you can authenticate them against Active Directory and allow that traffic to continue. Or behind the scenes, if the gateway already knows that the source IP address is associated with a user from the finance users group, the gateway won't even bother doing a captive portal if it already knows who that user is. And then here we have the URL that's going to be used for the redirect in the event captive portal needs to be used. And we'll go ahead and click on Next to continue. We have a little message that identity awareness is now active and enabled on Firewall 2. We'll go ahead and click on Finish. And ta-da! It's done. And I just realized that the URL that we have for the redirection in the event we need to do captive portal, that's not the URL I want to use on the 10.3 network. In fact, we can change that if we go over here to Identity Awareness. So we're still looking at the properties of Firewall 2. We're simply clicking on the Identity Awareness section. And this is also where we'd go if we wanted to identify other identity sources, by the way. But what I'd like to do right here is I'd like to change this redirect URL, and instead of using the outside IP address of Firewall 2, which is what that is, I want to use the IP address associated with Ethernet 1 on Firewall 2, which is 10.3.0.112. So to make that change, we'll go ahead and click on Settings here. And then regarding access settings, we'll go ahead and click on Edit. And from here, we'll change the IP address to that inside address. And looks like you just moved the cursor on me. I'm going to go ahead and highlight the existing IP address. It's going to be 10.3.0. Had to think about it. 112 here on Firewall 2. So in the event Firewall 2 has a policy that's using identity and it doesn't already know from Active Directory what the username is, when it redirects that user over to the captive portal, it'll redirect it over to this IP address, which is the inside or E1 interface on Firewall 2. That looks great. Also, one of the challenges is that the Firewall 2 is going to use a self-signed certificate as part of the captive portal. So the user, unless their browser has been trained to trust that certificate authority, is going to have the warning that says this certificate cannot be verified. So if you have a CA in-house that all the browsers already trust, you could go ahead and import a certificate for this firewall from that CA and avoid the security warning for the captive portal. So for this demonstration and for this lab, I'm going to go ahead and take the default of using the self-signed certificate and click OK. Also down here under Users Access, if we click on Settings regarding name and password login, we can specify how long we want to grant access after authentication has happened. I'm going to go ahead and say 5 minutes for this lab. We can also prompt for a user agreement. We can also edit that user agreement. So we'll just put in some simple text there, click OK, and click OK again. And we could also log out users when they close the portal browser, which implies they're going to keep the authentication browser open as long as they want to have authenticated access through the firewall. So with those options in place, we'll go ahead and click OK and OK again. And then it says the platform administration web portal URL in the platform portal page is https://678.3.0.112. And I have reason to believe that it's mistaken. I think it's pulling that from the wizard. However, we just went in and we specified this as the redirect URL. So let's take an extra moment to verify that after we click on yes to confirm. So now that that's done, let's go back to Firewall 2 just for a moment. We'll double click on it to open up the properties. And then we'll click on Identity Awareness. And there we go. So I just want to make sure the URL for the redirect was correct, which it is. 10.3.0.112, which is the E1 interface on Firewall 2. Great. So we'll go ahead and click OK. We'll click on Publish. So now we've taken care of the first two steps in Identity Awareness, and that is to enable the feature and also identify the sources. And what we just configured was Active Directory and also the ability to do Captive Portal. The last step is to use access role objects inside of a security policy that use identity. So to do that, on the left-hand side, we'll click on Security Policies on that tab to take us to Security Policies. And I'm going to take all of our existing sections that we currently have, and I'm going to use this button right here to collapse all sections. And let's create a brand new section at the very top so it's really clear where this rule is going to be. So we'll right-click on the existing section 1, and we'll select New Section Title above the current one that's selected. And we'll name this Identity Testing Section, and then we'll right-click on that section. And for New Rule, we'll add a new rule below that new section. So our new rule is going to be the new rule number 1. I'm number 1. I'm number 1. Okay, rule number 1, calm down. And let's call this Bob to Web Server. And for the source, we'll go ahead and click the plus symbol regarding the source. And this is where we want to use an access role object for the source in our policy that can include the information that it has to be Bob or a certain computer or coming from a certain network. And we're going to do that by creating and using an access role object. So here in the object picker, we'll click on the icon for new, and from the drop down, we'll select access role right here. So we'll click on access role, and let's call this Bob access role. That way when we see it, we'll know exactly what it is. And let's go ahead and specify that for networks, he has to be coming from the specific network, and we'll click on the plus symbol, and let's go ahead and choose the branch office object. And we can hover over branch office here just to verify that's the 10.3.0. So he has to have a source IP address of 10.3.0 something. And then if we go to users over here on the left, with users selected, we can go ahead and specify we're looking for a specific user. So here we could say we're looking for a member of a group. Because we have our identity source tied to Active Directory, we can pull from that. So here with the radio button for specific users/groups, we'll click on the plus symbol and check this out, showing us nuggetlab.com. And we'll go ahead and click on this icon right here to show navigation pane. And over here in the navigation pane, we can go ahead and double click on nuggetlab.com and double click on the container called users. And there's administrator and there's Bob. And Bob is a user in Active Directory. So if we double click on Bob, that'll add Bob as a specific user as part of this Bob access role. And furthermore, if we wanted to, we could go to machines and we could specify an exact machine that Bob would have to be coming from. Again, that would be pulled from Active Directory. So in this case, we'll just leave the network requirement coming from the branch office and the user requirement being that it's Bob. So with these two basic elements as part of the Bob access role, we'll click on OK. And that puts the Bob access role right here in this source column. So let me expand that just a little bit. Then for the destination, we'll click on the plus symbol and we're going to put in our web server. If we don't have an object for that web server, we can simply create a new host object by clicking on the new icon. From the drop down, selecting host, and then we'll call this web_srvr for web server, and put in the IP address of 67.83.0.100, which is the server we want Bob specifically allowed access to, and we'll click on OK. So that's in the destination column, and then for these services, let's go ahead and specify HTTP. So we'll type in HTTP, it'll give us a shorter list to pick from, and we'll simply grab HTTP right here by double clicking on it. Great, so far, if the source is a username Bob coming from the 10.3.0 network and going to the IP address of 67.83.0.100, and the service is HTTP using TCP port 80, then the action is going to be, and we are going to go ahead and specify more here from the action. And the action we want to have is permit, aka accept, but we also want to enable the captive portal. That way, if Bob is coming in from a system that hasn't yet been identified in Active Directory, we can stop him, redirect him over to the captive portal, ask for his authentication, verify it really is Bob, and then let Bob continue on his way to the final destination. So with that portal enabled, we'll go ahead and click on OK. And let's go ahead and do logging on this as well. So in the track column, we'll specify that we want to log it. And for the install on column, let's go ahead and specify that we're going to apply this rule on Firewall 2. So we'll select Firewall 2, and then we'll click Publish. We'll give that a moment to complete, and then we'll install policy by clicking Install Policy, and we'll push it out to all of our firewalls by clicking Install. And that indicates it was successful. Fantastic. So now let's test this. To test this, we're going to go in the lab environment to DCNUG, and DCNUG is a computer that is connected over on the branch network at 10.3.0. So we'll authenticate to log on to DCNUG. I just want to verify that we're at the right device. So we're on DCNUG. DCNUG is sitting on this network at .100. And I've got a shortcut up here that's going to take us to 67.83.0.100, which is our web server. And just for grins, I am going to verify that shortcut really goes to that location. Let's go to properties of the shortcut. And sure enough, 67.83.0.100, perfect. Okay, just want to make sure it's taken us to the right place. So we'll go ahead and double click on that icon. That'll launch Chrome and take us out to 67.83.0.100. And what's happening here is we have just been redirected to the captive portal on Firewall 2. And because it's using a self-signed certificate, that's why we have the warning here. We'll click on Advanced and then scroll down a little bit and click on Proceed. And now it's asking us to go ahead and authenticate. So let's authenticate as Bob using the username Bob and the lab password and click Login. Now notice we're getting this little message, and that's because we said we want a prompt for the user agreement. So if we click on Terms and Conditions right here, it opens up a new tab. This is the user agreement. That's the user agreement we typed in. So I'll close that little tab, and then we'll say yes, we've read and we agree to the terms and conditions, and click on Next. Then it says, network access granted, congratulations. And based on how it was configured, you've got less than 5 minutes, and that's a countdown timer showing us how much time we have left. Also, because of how we configured it, we need to leave this window open to continue to get network access through the firewall. So what we can do is we can click here, and it'll take us to our original destination, which was 67.83.0.100, and we have a window in the background still with the captive portal information here. And that's only because we required it when we set it up. If you don't want to require the original window to be held open for the access, we don't have to select that. So here we are at the IIS server. The authentication was successful. And now let's go back to our management PC and take a look at the logs. So back here at Client NUG, and let's just make a note. This is rule number 1 with the identity information here. So over here on the left, if we click on the Logs and Monitor tab, and currently we have a search for service HTTP, which is going to serve our purposes nicely here because that's what we're looking for anyway, but we can certainly change that. So we could say service HTTP, and we could also specify the source, and we could specify branch office. So we just click and build our filters as we want to, and then press enter to implement them. And over here in this action column right here, we have a whole bunch of redirects that have happened before we finally had the acceptance and the access. So if we click this top log entry, which is the source of 10.3.0.100 going to our web server on TCP port 80, it shows that the access rule that was matched is Bob going to web server. And if we double click on that to look at the details, Here in the details, it shows us that it was Bob, the user, that initiated this packet that's being forwarded through the network to the web server. So in this lab, we've taken a look at both setting up and verifying identity awareness inside a checkpoint environment. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.